Good afternoon. My name is Eric Pigors, and I'm a solution architect on the Fast Track team. We have a Regression Suite Automation Tool workshop. It's 4 days, and you can get more info on the next one at the Fast Track booth. It's over here. And has anybody been to that workshop? Okay. Somebody was asking about it. And the doc site is also really good. Probably enough to get you started, but let's get started. So in the test pyramid, the RSAT sweet spot classifies the tests as business cycle tests and multiple component tests. The interesting thing is that they don't require a developer, unlike the other tests in the pyramid. So the Regression Suite Automation Tool, or RSAT. The RSAT is it records business tasks using the Finance and Operations Task Recorder, and it converts them into a suite of tests that you can run in an automated way. And again, you don't need to write source code, so these are typically done by functional power users. You don't need a developer. You do this, RSAT tests are for user acceptance or regression testing. Whether you're taking a Microsoft service update, you're applying an updated customization package, or you're changing your configuration to validate that nothing in your critical business processes got broken. And when I talk to customers, I'm always telling them that they have to validate their critical business processes, right? And for people it's a manual task. It takes people and it takes a lot of time. And even with 8 updates a year, right, it becomes a burden on people. Time and money, so. Technically, the Regression Suite tool has been supported since Platform 20. You do need to, it could be sensitive to application updates. Something that you record on one application update may not play again on another one. But in general, the one version backward compatibility is helping make sure that they will still play. All the things that entails will keep your tests or your recordings working. We don't remove controls. We don't do stuff like that. And we'll talk about some granularity things that you can do when you're creating them to minimize if you do have to change something at some point. You have to have access to LCS and Azure DevOps that it's connected to. A specific one you need is for the workshop I mentioned is a DevOps Test Manager license. If you happen to have Visual Studio Enterprise, the upper tier subscriptions is Visual Studio Enterprise, or Test Professional, or an MSDN subscription. They include the Test Manager. Otherwise, it's in the Azure portal. It's called Basic plus Test Manager, and you can purchase the license there. I always wondered why Basic, right? Was not the most basic, but anyway. The RSAT tool and the machine that it's installed on have to have access to the Finance and Operations environment via the web browser, which is pretty basic, but you of course have to have access to that. You can run it from your laptop or from a VM, and we'll talk more about that as well. Finally, the machine where the RSAT tool is running, you also need Excel for editing the parameter files. To some degree, you don't always have to do that, but it is needed at some point. Okay, so all of our environments start with Lifecycle Services and Azure DevOps, which they're already connected for other reasons, right? And we have a project. There's our Finance and Operations environment talking to Lifecycle Services, and the Task Recorder is in Finance and Operations. We use that for authoring and then for playback, and it doesn't have to be the exact same environment, of course. The Task Recorder puts the recordings into the BPM, and from there they can go into the Azure DevOps project. Then we'll see the RSAT client and tool pop up here, and the RSAT tool, of course, runs the tests on the finance and operations environment over here, and the results are stored and managed in DevOps. We support any finance and operations environment. You can use a tier 1. Of course, a tier 2 has more likely to have your production data on it, or at least a newer copy. We don't support Service Fabric yet, but it's on the roadmap. But the test client, where the RSAT's installed, you do have to have admin access actually to that machine because you have to install the RSAT tool. But it supports Windows 10 and Windows Server. Yep. So we're going to talk a little bit about the process, the whole process. So we're going to start by defining a test scenario. And we want to define a test scenario that has a predictable outcome and that supports repetitive playback. A predictable outcome primarily means that we can validate what we're testing in some way, and we know that we have some definition that it failed or it didn't fail, or it passed or it didn't pass. And then repetitive playback, we want to make sure that we can play the test as many times as we want on the same environment and it not fail just because it's the second time or the 10th time, but the second time is very common, right? If you have a very simple test where you create a customer, if you give it a certain ID, you just type it in, you play it again, it's going to fail because the customer already exists. That's what we want to avoid, and we talk about a lot of techniques for doing that. And this can be done during the analysis or design phase of the project. That's typically when it's done. And we want to be able to validate the outcome of the test automatically as a part of the test case, because our whole purpose is to avoid manual work here that we have to repeat over and over again. Okay? Okay, so here's our scenario. It's pretty straightforward. We're going to create a production order, estimate it, schedule it, release it, start the production order, and then in our case, we're just going to report it as finished. There's probably some stuff in between start and report as finished in real life, but we're just going to have it simplified like this, right? So a couple things. We already see that we have 2 roles involved. We have the production planner and the machine operator. So for one thing, a test case can only be run in one role. So anytime we need to switch roles during a test, we would need a new test case. And we want the test cases or recordings, they mean the same thing when I say test case or recording. We want them to be, sort of narrow. You don't need a programmer, but you do need some strategy and a little almost engineering to make these things sort of work and be efficient and not be a lot of maintenance. You also need a separate recording or test case if you need to wait for the batch for a batch job to finish. I was doing some testing last night, and I just going to rebuild a dimension set balance, and the only option is to run it in a batch. So that has to be the end of my test case, and then I have to start a new one when I want to look at those results or whatever. Another scenario where you may create multiple test cases or recordings is for reuse, because you want to be able to reuse, maybe you want to have separate create and estimate, because sometimes after the create you do something other than estimate. That's theoretical, but you want to be able to not have multiple recordings that do exactly the same thing or close to the same thing. mainly because, or well, at least one reason that you don't want to do that is because the recordings cannot be edited. So if it breaks, you need to re-record it. And so you don't want to have to be recording for an hour and then make a mistake or it breaks and have to start over. So keeping them sort of bite-sized is part of that engineering that I talked about. But the good news is that you can create data in one recording and pass it to the next recording. It's called chaining of test cases. So we could create that production order and then pass the ID to the estimate test case, and the estimate one would not have the ID in the recording. It would just have this variable that comes from outside. So all of these would not need to, you record them by typing it in. When you record the estimate one, you'll type in the ID, but then you can, when you chain it together, you can use the variable to, in the test scenario, which is multiple test cases, replace that value with the variable. And then you want to, each individual test should have some validation that it worked or that it didn't fail. It just makes it easier, right? If you get all to the end, if it fails and you don't know where it failed, it's better to have some, it's like some baby steps to work on the validation, at least some. Of course, the end validation is also super important, and here it is. So we added 2 more test cases because we want to get the on-hand quantity for the finished good item before the test starts. And the reason we want to get it is so that we can make sure when we are done that it's however many finished goods we created, it's the beginning value plus the number that we created. And if we just say we validate it as 5 and then we run it again and it's 6, we can't repeat our test. So, like I talked about at the first slide. Okay, so for recording the test cases, you use the task recorder in finance and operations. It's the exact same task recorder as for creating task guides. In fact, we tell you not to use lookups and for regression for test cases because if you add something, things move around. It just picks the second one, and if there's a different value there, then you won't get the one you did before. And you'll still get the warning from the task recorder that's, if you type something in, it says use the lookup, but you should ignore it because it's the same, because our purpose is a little different. So you should have your functional architects and your key users doing these. The other way that they're different is that you have to add validation into the recording, and you also have to sort of mark which fields you need to copy and for chaining and stuff like that. It's not difficult, but it is a little different than for a task guide. You can kind of think of each test case as a sort of a method, right? It's got some stuff coming in, it's got some stuff coming out, and it does a few things in the middle. So, and keeping them relatively small is a pretty good practice. These are typically recorded during user acceptance testing when the data migration and the code is starting to stabilize, and right, because we don't want, if our customizations aren't done, we won't be able to have our new fields that we need to type in and stuff like that. And these test cases are the building blocks for a test scenario, which will put multiple tests together to, like we did in this demo of the sample. So the preparing of the test scenario is taking those test cases and in Azure DevOps, creating a test suite, which is a listing of test cases. And so two different test suites can reuse the same test case if they want. Like for creating a production order, you could use that in multiple. This is typically done by the solution architect or test manager. That's where you need that license. And you can do a test scenario as soon as all of its recordings are finished. And then you need to validate that the scenario is consistent in terms of the chaining and that kind of thing, and the validation. Okay, so then you can execute. There's a subtle difference between preparing it and executing it. You can run the test suite, and you can verify the results are all put in Azure DevOps, and the solution architect or test manager again. And you can do this whenever you need to do a regression test. And whether it's a service update or updated customization package. And then you can get your results to verify that your scenarios still work. The current limitations are you can't use it for integration tests. There is data task automation available for some integration tests. Often Office integration, the Excel add-in is not supported. Sort of anything outside of finance and operations, the root. There was a session earlier today for point of sale. It has been recently added and in the warehousing app as well. And then custom controls and anything that the task report does not support, because we're completely dependent on that. Some recent features that are the most notable, I guess, are RSAT uses an authentication method based on certificates that has been in finance and operations for a while, and it wasn't specifically created for this, so we're using it. And the latest RSATs will create a certificate and install it on the computer that RSAT's installed on, and then you have to copy this 50-character thumbprint and put it in the config file on the AOS, and if it's a multi-box environment, all AOSs. And so the recent addition was being able to add it and install it. You still have to put it on the AOSs manually. There was a reliability thing where sometimes tabs, like fast tabs, would be closed and the recording would fail because it couldn't access the control. So they automatically open up all those things now just to avoid those silly failures because of different state. There was more information put in the test log, the environment name, the version of the RSAT tool, the user, the company, and then any parameter values that came from the chaining. The actual values are also logged now, which helps for debugging and things like that. There's a custom prefix for the test runs, which show up in DevOps. And like in my example, I named my prefix PEEP 10.07 because I was testing that build. So then they show up kind of tagged that way. Helps you keep things straight a little bit. The configuration dialog was simplified. The more commonly used things are put on one page and the less common are on a second tab. The error messages include a lot of this same stuff, and the errors are more prominent in the in DevOps. Let's see here. Yeah, and then retail point of sale is in preview, and there was a session earlier, so you should probably be able to find the recording of that. And then support for the warehouse management mobile app was also added in 10.06. That's this month, really. What month is this? Yeah, November, yeah. Okay, the upcoming features are security configuration, getting rid of the certificate and having to go onto the AOSs, and specifically needing admin access or having to RDP. Yeah, and then some more improvements to the task recorder to improve the experience of saving the recordings into the business process library, and being able to validate the expected number of lines on a grid control. Data agnostic guidelines. You want to minimize your data dependencies, and that means things like don't depend on transactions to be there because they tend to come and go, or depending on data. And you can use your customers, and if it's your production data, you would probably want to. But let's just say that you need a, let me see here. Yeah, you can depend on master data, but not on transaction data. And it says if you change any settings, you should change them back. But you have to really have a good reason to change the setting, because I'm assuming users aren't doing that, and you want to try to mimic what users are doing as much as possible. Improving data selection would be, one option would be or an example would be, if you're looking for a customer with a certain method of payment, go to the customer form, filter by that method of payment, and then copy the value, again, and chain that into the next test case. So you could have a test case to select a credit customer that has this kind of payment term or that kind of payment terms. And then you could feed that into your sales order test case, right? So that's the idea. And you could have another one for selecting a different kind of a customer. Those are the sorts of engineering things to consider. Let's see here, yeah. You can also, like for invoice IDs or where you have to type in values, even if it's a new customer, once you can do it the first time in the Excel when you record it, but then you can, in the Excel, you can use the year as a number to generate an ID, and then of course you can chain that to the other places that you need it, and that avoids that being able to, it failing when you try to run it twice in a row. And then using relative validation, like the demo scenario showed, going and getting the on-hand balance of the item, and then using that in the validation to adding onto it or making sure it's greater than that or something along those lines. The other thing to do in grids is to filter it. It's ideal if you can get it down to one row. That feature that's coming for counting the number of rows will be helpful as well, but filtering to one row is pretty useful, and it makes for stronger tests. There is the view edit mode can trip you up, so you can have a test case at the beginning to set the view edit mode to one value, and then you can depend on that. And then we have a few numbers from some people some actual customers who are working on RSAT. So we have 31 test suites, 170 recordings, so that's over 5 recordings per test suite. 7 resources, 1 month. Test suites run in 2 hours. 12 suites, 47, so that's not quite 4 test cases per. They spent about 200 hours doing it. The test suites run in 2 hours. Here's 208 test cases, 17 suites, so they have like over 10. And manual testing went from 2 weeks to 3 days. It seems like about 2 to 2.5 hours is how long the tests are taking to run. 7 test suites, 50 processes with 140, 4 resources, 1 month. So it takes some effort, but there's definitely some value. Okay. Oh, okay. I didn't put that in there. Please fill out your evaluation, and I'll be up here for some questions. If you have more questions, the Fast Track booth is right over here. Thank you so much.